So my name's David. I am London-born, British, Armenian on my mother's side. So that will explain a little bit about this talk in that I've entitled it History of Armenian Photography and Armenian History Through Photography. So it's about history and photography, Armenian history and photography. So very, very a broad topic. I've tried to make it broad and introductory, but at the same time it's an idiosyncratic history as well, because it's about the particular areas that I've researched and my own particular areas of interest. So because my mother's family were from Ottoman Armenia, Harput, a lot of my work is about that particular part of Armenian history. So we will look a little bit about photography in other areas, but a lot of this is about that part. So, without further ado, I hope everyone can hear me and see the screen. There'll be a lot of pictures. So, I've given this presentation a dual title: A History of Armenian Photography and Armenian History Through Photography, as an indication of two separate things we'll be doing. So it's about the history of Armenian photography, how it began, the establishment of studios, the lives and careers of photographers, and the making of pictures. At the same time, it's about Armenian history through photographs. So this gets away from the business of photography, the craft, the trade, as it were, and asks other questions. Why did people make pictures? Why did people pose and sit for pictures? What were they saying with these photographs? For whom were they made, and where did they go? And what can we learn from the past through an examination of photographs? What exactly are we looking at in photographs? What should we look for in photographs? What can they tell us today about the past? And this, for me, is one of the great beauties of photography. It provides a fascinating subject, both in and of itself, but at the same time, you can never actually get away from the rest of the world. It never is simply photography in and of itself. While we can tell a history of painting without ever leaving the artist's studios, focusing upon style, technique, and artistic schools, it is not really possible when you're dealing with photographs. Because photographs are always something beyond the camera, beyond the studio. They don't wider world, its people, its places, ideas, and events. And photography not only shows these things, it's not only about these things, but in a sense it springs from these things as well. So I'll be starting off by talking about how photography is itself a product of the world, of a changing world in particular. It was brought about in a time of great technological upheaval, but social and political upheaval as well. So we'll begin close to the beginning. 1839 is generally taken as the beginning point of photography. The emergence of photography at this time was actually the product of many years' work and experimentation by many people whose primary aim was to create a lasting photographic image. The basic technology of the camera had existed for centuries. As the camera obscura. This was something that had been used by artists in particular for quite a long time. Basically, the camera obscura, the dark box, the dark chamber, with a small aperture by which light enters and creates an image of the outside world within the dark chamber through the light rays entering that space. But the question, or what was sought in the early 19th century, was how to make this image. It was never a permanent image. It lasted as long as the light did. So the question was how to make these temporary images permanent, how to fix them. And this is what we now consider of as photography, not the picture, but the lasting picture, that moment in time which is caught on paper and there forever for us to study. So in 1839, there were two announcements made independently in London and Paris. So it became clear that the fixing of the photographic image had finally been achieved, and different from the very beginning, photography was about different techniques and different formats, often rival formats, different ways of actually fixing the image. So it began in London and Paris, but quickly spread from there. And it's important to situate the start of the dawn of photography in this industrial age, because it went hand in hand with wider scientific discovery. And that can be seen from the fact many of the early pioneers were also involved in other scientific advancements, such as Joseph Niepce, who was one of the key early pioneers. He was also credited with developing the internal combustion engine. So photography was very much a scientific instrument, part of the industrial age. And it is wrapped up in this idea of new technologies, not just technologies of image making and image reproduction, but of communication and travel as well. So the other advancements of the age, such as the steamboats and the railways, played a very important part in photography. It contributed to a general shrinking of the world, and it accounts for the way in which photography, which was invented in London and Paris, actually quickly, swiftly spread from those cities to elsewhere. These new technologies account for its rapid spread and the way in which it was actually practiced in different parts of the world. So almost as soon as it had been invented, photography was on the move, expanding westwards towards the USA and eastwards through Europe. And we might very loosely divide the photographers of this era into two types. Those that set up and ran portrait studios, and those that travelled and photographed what they thought of as being the distant, exotic parts of the world. So this is what characterizes a lot of early photography. Western photographers found themselves particularly drawn to what was termed the Orient, a very loose term that could be applied to just about anything east of Constantinople. They headed eastwards for several reasons, but chief amongst them was a 19th century obsession with the East as a place of exotic images and adventure. And this in itself was partially due to the nature of the age. It was an age of empire, and there was a sense. The 19th century offered a sense of modernity in this way. It offered citizens of the industrial nations through this technological advancement a sense of modernity, and to travel and make photographs in itself was thought to be a modern activity and a modern process. And this was bound up and reinforced by corresponding interest in the others of the world, a desire to see and study those people and places that were felt to be outside of the modern industrialized West, those thought to be not modern, not developed. We'll start to look at the Near East, which was thought to be a place of the old and the ancient, and it also offered Westerners a sort of diversity that was not to be found at that time in Western societies, a chance to study a vast variety of different cultures. And one very practical reason why photographers headed to the Near East was the quality of the light. Western photographers, often starved of decent light at home, were drawn to those places of strong light, where photographs could be made far more quickly and easily. So popular destinations of this time included Constantinople, Athens, Alexandria, Cairo, Luxor, Jerusalem, Damascus, many places which are still popular destinations today. And we have famous visitors to the East, such as the Frenchman Maxime Ducamp, who travelled in 1849 and 1850 with the French writer Gustave Flaubert. So the interests of photographers were often mimicked by the interests of Western writers and Western artists, this interest in the exotic East. And the most famous British traveller photographer of the time was Francis Frith. Shown here in, this is his book, Egypt and Palestine, Photographed and Described, with the photographer himself on the right-hand side, dressed up in what was thought of as a sort of Eastern Oriental garb. So it went hand in hand with this sense of Eastern adventure for the West. And the book itself, this book proved very popular in Britain. So photography was not just an activity for those who travelled, but was a way for them to show the world to those that did not travel. So it was really only a small minority, of course, who travelled at that era. It was heavily to do with class and wealth. So there was a small amount of people who were able to travel, those who could afford to travel, those who were in position to travel. And for everyone else were armchair travellers in a sense. They travelled through the writings and, as the 19th century progressed, through the images that were provided by those that did travel. So they're involved in imaginative travel through pictures. So it was photography was founded in a sense of modernity, but also in a developing sense of imperial identity. So studies were often based upon vanished civilizations, and were also very much to do with contemporary power, with the empires of the 19th century constantly imagining themselves as the modern inheritors of the great past empires. This is why places like Egypt were of such interest, was that this was how the French and the English imagined themselves, almost as the modern pharaohs. And so it's very important to situate the start of photography within this imperial era, in the context of the growth of the British, French, and the Russian empires, and a little later the German Empire, and the competition between them for new territory, particularly the competitions that were taking place in Persian and Ottoman lands. And this is an idea of photography as a certain sort of cultural battleground. This is a photograph from the Crimean War, some of the very earliest photographic images of war. This is the British photographer Roger Fenton, who was sent by the British government to photograph the war in the Crimea after reports of death, disease, and starvation and terrible conditions had appeared in the British press and were causing lots of consternation in public opinion. So he was sent there by the British government to create a more positive and heroic rendering of the war. And this, so straight away from the earliest days of photography, you can see how photographs were always made for particular purposes, and they were particular images. The photographs were never, ever the literal truth. It was always taken from a certain perspective, and always with the idea of presenting a certain idea, a certain image. So and this is Fenton's photographic van in the Crimea, which gives you a sense. We're talking about a time when photography was, of course, quite an arduous process, which plays an important role, I think, we'll talk about it a bit more. It's important to bear these things in mind when looking at photographs made in the 19th century, to realize how much work was required in order to make images. You get a sense that something important is being relayed to us. It's a world away from today when we can make images very, very easily, and we almost live in a constant stream of photographic images and photographic activity. Back when photographs were so much more expensive, more arduous, they took a lot longer to make, that meant that every photographic image had to be carefully thought through and prepared and created for very specific reasons. So we think about photographs as snapshots, but this is when thinking about older photographs, the idea of the snapshot is something we should ignore. We should forget about this. The term snapshot is from an era when the first handheld portable cameras were in use, and you could take photographs very, very quickly. So it was. Photographers were able to look at something and in an instant make an image of it. In the era we're talking about, the snapshot did not exist. We're talking about carefully thought through and composed images. So that's a slightly longish introduction to photography and how photography came to be in the Near East. And it also explains how photography got to be practiced by Armenians. Essentially, there were, throughout this time, these photographic expeditions, there were a number of places. Constantinople in itself was a place of interest, but it was also an important port of call. People passing through to other destinations would often stop in Constantinople. So Roger Fenton himself spent some time in Constantinople on his way to the Crimea and made photographs there, and many other photographers did as well on their way to other places. And it's in the aftermath of the Crimean War in the later part of the 1850s that Armenians first become involved in photography. So it starts here on the Grand Rue de Pera in what was then Constantinople. And this is the main thoroughfare in what was Pera, the most European part of the city. It was the most European street in the most European part of the most European city in the empire. So this was where photography really got a toehold in the empire. So in its early days, there were studios here set up by British, French, Italians, Germans. And in 1856, the first Armenians in photography, the Abdullah Frere, learnt photography from a German called Rabach. We just know his surname, Rabach. He was a photographer and a chemist, which I will talk about a little bit more. But this is one of the early, again, this idea of photography very much being a science at the time, and chemists were very big in the trade in its early years. So, the Abdullah Frere, whose studio in 1858 was opened up just off this, just to the left of the image there, they learnt from a chemist and photographer Rabach in 1856. When he returned to Germany in 1858, they took over his studio. So this follows a pattern which becomes established of Armenians learning directly from the European visitors to Constantinople. Now, it is particularly Ottoman Christians who take up the photographic trade. It's most notably Armenians, but there were also a good number of Greeks as well. And there are various reasons for this Christian involvement in the photographic trade. So we can point to established economic and cultural ties to the West and traditional domestic roles in the empire as the craftsmen and the merchants and businessmen. So these are the people who time and time again over centuries shown themselves to be interested in what was coming out of Europe, and recently the new European technologies. And they had become involved in not only using these things, but importing them, introducing them into the empire in the first place. So this in turn explained the dominance in other fields, related fields that became important in photography. So as well as being craftsmen and merchants, they were also the chemists and the pharmacists, as I've been saying, during the days when photography was very much related to chemical processes and chemical innovation in chemistry. It was often the chemists who were also involved in making pictures. And another factor was the Armenian history of printing, with the Armenians having produced the first printed books in the Ottoman Empire and remaining at the forefront of that industry. And there was also the further factor that I should mention about religion. It's often said that religion played a part in these developments, specifically that there were prohibitions against images in Muslim and Jewish culture. And certainly this played a role in more rural areas, but I'm not entirely sure it is the case in the metropolis, as you certainly find Muslim and Jewish interest in images, at least from a sitter's point of view. You find them as taking an interest in having their photographs made towards the end of the 19th century, and then in the early 20th century is when you find the first Muslim studios appear on this same street. So in terms of religion and photography, what we should say is that it's quite a nuanced and complicated topic, and there's no simple, straightforward answer to that question. So, the Abdullahs started in photography in 1858 when Rabach left for Germany, and they developed their craft and techniques further with a trip to Paris in the early 1860s. Photography quickly becomes concerned with exchange. It is about Armenians learning from Westerners heading eastwards, but you always find that Armenians themselves tend to then make trips to Europe to learn new techniques. And especially during these early days when photographic processes were continually changing and new techniques were being developed, it was very important for photographers to keep up with the latest developments. So in the 1860s, they turned their business into the city's most famous and successful studio, one that catered to the growing foreign contingent. So again, it's important to situate this in the European part of the city. This was where a lot of the European businessmen were to be found, and also this is where the foreign embassies were to be found as well. And this is where the Europeans who were passing through the city stayed also. And it was the foreigners and the wealthy foreigners as well who could afford to pay for images. And so there was a brisk trade both to the Europeans permanently based in the city and to tourists. So before the advent of light portable cameras, going to a studio was part of the tourist experience. So a lot of the studios specialized in these sorts of images that appealed to Westerners. This is the image of the Orient as a somewhat languorous, exotic place. You'll find the veiled women, smoking pipes, the fez, often as an air of decadence and quiet and slowness to it. It appeals to a certain Western idea of what the East was. And visitors also were in the habit of having their portraits taken as well. Some of them in Eastern garb, as you saw with the Francis Frith picture earlier, sometimes just a more straightforward picture. This is Samuel Clemens' Mark Twain when he was in Constantinople in 1867. So he was at the Abdullah Frere studio to have his portrait made. This was a way of taking back a souvenir with you. And this was part of the process. It was about having your picture made, but it was also about the photograph as an object, what the photograph itself said. And so you'd take home a print which had the name of the most famous photographic studio in the city. And as some of you may be able to say, it also says photographers to His Majesty the Imperial Sultan, with the Sultan's Tura above his seal above that. So it was taking home a little part of the Orient. You can always learn a huge amount from looking at the backs of photographs. And so this tells us that the Abdullah Frere had been appointed as the royal photographers, as it were. Because in 1863, they were appointed as the official court photographers. So already you see how photography starts to take hold in the East. It's no longer just about foreigners, but there's the emergence of a domestic market as well. So as might be expected, this being appointed to the official court photographers proved a huge boost to business. What was good enough for the Sultan was generally good enough for everyone else, and it was a huge draw to be able to have your photograph made at the court, the studio of the court photographers. And as I say, it shows you how it was photography was starting to get away from simply being a Western medium. So there remained. It is important though that we're dealing with the Ottoman Sultan. So there are still issues of money here. There's there are the huge costs that are still involved. Photography for some time was still the domain of the wealthy and the privileged. So the Abdullah Frere did a lot of work for the Ottoman Sultan, making a lot of images of the empire. These are from a famous album that this is the next sultan after Abdulaziz appointed the Abdullahs as court photographers. This is the next sultan, Abdul Hamid, who made these huge albums for the American Library of Congress and for the British Library. These were sort of this was a sort of PR campaign. This was to show foreign powers the might and the grandeur of his empire. Photography was playing a very important role in self-promotion, imperial self-promotion. But photography in time did become more affordable and more accessible, especially with the proliferation of studios, which resulted in the driving down of prices. So we see other studios cropping up on the Grand Rue. You can see a sign, you might be able to see a sign there. So Saber and Joaillier, they were another great studio of the time. Saber was Pascal Saber, who was of Syrian and Armenian origin. And he later teamed up with another photographer, and they also became important court photographers, and their sign was a prominent feature on the street for many years to come. This is some of their work for Abdulaziz. So these photographs of the traditional costumes of the Ottoman Empire were taken to the Universal Exhibition in Vienna in 1873. Again, dealing with a certain European idea of the East. And there was also Boros Tarkulian, who was in this studio here, called himself Phoebus. And there's the back of one of his photographs. So you might be able to see how Armenian photographers in the Ottoman Empire, as they opened up their studios, much like business people of other times and places, were in the habit of self-aggrandizement through the names they chose for themselves, with two distinct trends emerging, calling yourselves frères, the French for brothers, to give a certain hint of European culture, or also here with Phoebus, to pick a name from myth and legend. Here, Phoebus being another name for the sun god Apollo. You might be able to see that in the picture here. Often it was to do with gods and ideas of light and illumination. So Phoebus had learned his craft in the studio of the Abdullah Frere in the 1870s. And just like as the Abdullah Frere learnt from a German, from the Abdullahs, the trade passes along to other Armenians. So in Constantinople, and also elsewhere in the empire, this is Yesei Garabedian. He was born in Talas and became a priest in the Armenian Orthodox convent of St. James's in Jerusalem. And he traveled to the Abdullah Frere's studio to learn photography, and then ended up taking it back to Jerusalem with him, and he became the first local photographer in Jerusalem. He also made further journeys to Europe to pick up techniques and processes, particularly a trip of 1863 that took him to Marseille, Paris, London, Liverpool, and Manchester. And he became the patriarch in Jerusalem. So this is a very interesting meeting of two seemingly different worlds. So it's important to note the difference that setting and context makes. Photography was not the same everywhere, and a photographer from a certain background working in a certain place was no doubt doing something quite different to someone elsewhere. Garabedian, working in Jerusalem, seems to have been drawn to the craft as it allowed him to make pictures of the Holy Land and religious sites there. And he was also interested in its potential to replace the more laborious arts of drawing and engraving while still reproducing some of that luminous effect that they were known for. And he also set up just as he had brought in these photographic skills from Constantinople, he then set up at St. James's a photographic studio and a photographic training school. So the Armenian Patriarch there was then responsible for training up the next generation of local photographers who worked in Jerusalem. Again, many of them Armenian, but also Arabs as well, and people from lots of different backgrounds. So this was a context quite different to Constantinople, and you can see how sort of photography morphs and shifts. It changes in each new location it arrives in. But there are also similarities. Garabedian's work did have a commercial aspect to it, and he partly responded to this tourist interest in Jerusalem and the growing demand from tourists and pilgrims for souvenirs and visual reminders of their visits. And you also see he was producing in particular popular formats, including this stereoscopic image. These stereoscopic cards were composed of two near identical photographs made from very similar. These were two almost identical images made from very similar positions, separated only by a small space, which was basically to mimic the human eyes. The principle was that the different images would merge into one and appear three-dimensional when seen through a special viewfinder. You might also be able to see how this particular card, again looking at the details of photographic prints, this particular card is marked not with Garabedian's name, but with the name H.C. White, Vermont. So, this is because they were not only produced in Jerusalem, but licensed for reproduction abroad by companies that specialized in these sorts of foreign views. Once again, we're looking at photographs pitched to the armchair travelers abroad, and Armenian photographers happily supplied plentiful images for these purposes. And it shows you sometimes how misleading labels can be. Certainly in the early days, photographers were not always credited with their work. Despite the fact that Garabedian aspired to emulate the traditional arts with his photographs, he was by no means treated as an artist. Photographers at this time tended to be looked upon as simple workers, craftsmen, rather than artists. So there are a great many images that do not have the names of makers attached to them. So we're able to see how photography gradually, or quite quickly actually, moves its way westward. Britain, France, Germany, then Ottoman Empire, Constantinople, Jerusalem. But this is just one of the paths that photography took. We can also see how it moved eastwards, north of the Black Sea. It appeared in the big cities of the Russian Empire, and in the 1850s, it was largely French, German, and Austrian photographers that were to be found in the studios of St. Petersburg and Moscow. But again, it was still on the move. It didn't just stay in those places, it kept moving. So due to a concern for the peasantry that had been brought about by the writings of Tolstoy and Turgenev, this photography was taken out into the Russian countryside. This was an interest also inspired by Russian imperial expansion into the regions to the south. So there were numerous scientific and military expeditions southwards into the Caucasus and Central Asia, the new exotic spaces. So this is Sergei Prokopin-Gorsky, who was, these date from the early 20th century, but his survey project is probably one of the most famous of the era. He took the camera throughout the whole of the Russian Empire. His photographs of Armenians were mostly from Artvin, which was at that time Near the Black Sea, at the time on the lower edge of the Russian Empire, the southwestern edge in the Caucasus. Lands that had only just recently become Russian. These were part of the lands that had gone from Ottoman hands to Russian hands after the 1877-1878 Russian-Ottoman War. And today it is northeastern Turkey. Photography was bound up in these shifting spaces, the spaces that changed hands between empires, or the spaces that empires had their eye on. For Western photographers to be, or for Russian photographers to be in certain places, this cultural interest normally went hand in hand with political and economic interests as well. It is rare to find a photographer working in isolation. They're normally one of many forces working in particular parts of the world. So these are two Gorsky photographs, and this gives you a good idea of two different kinds of picture that are being made at the time. We can loosely call these pictures Tolstoy on the right-hand side, a portrait of Tolstoy. On the left-hand side, you're looking at more what we might call documentary photography. The caption is Armenian woman in national costume. So the difference between these photographs then is, while they're both ostensibly portraits, the image of Tolstoy is the photographer actually depicting a particular person, a named individual. This is a portrait of a famous, renowned, named Russian writer. On the left-hand side, you have an anonymous figure. This is more a document. This does not endeavour at all to describe a particular person. There's no name attached. There's no desire to show this person as a particular individual leading their own individual life. Instead, they are made as a symbol. This is a suggestion of what a certain kind of people in a certain kind of place look like. And this is what a lot of photography was between these 2 points at the time. There was a fair amount of overlap, both in terms of what was being done and the people who were doing it. But it's in the way in which it treats its subjects here, we can look at two distinct trends in photography at the time. So it's through this Russian route that photography arrived with the Armenians of the Caucasus, particularly in Tbilisi, then known as Tiflis, and Yerevan. These were the important centers of trade in the region at the time. So one major example of Armenian photography there was Johannes Kirchian, a pioneering photographer based in Yerevan in the 1870s, 1880s, and he was part of early surveys of the city of Ani, the city of 1,001 churches. Again, this photography was a lot to do with the shift of borders. It had been on Ottoman lands for centuries, but had lain largely neglected. It was only with the shift in borders of the late 1870s that Ani was, it had visitors and interest early on in the 19th century, but it was only once it became Russian that it was rediscovered, as it were. It was rediscovered by, we can look at the text here, which is in French and Armenian. These photographs were made for a domestic Armenian audience. It was part of an Armenian rediscovery of Ani. It was part of a rediscovery of Armenia. These pictures go hand in hand with the growing 19th century idea amongst Armenians of a collective national community. And as always, national ideas have a basis in the past. And connecting through text and images like this to the medieval kingdom, of which Ani, the medieval Armenian kingdom, of which Ani was the capital, played a role in this new identity formation of the 19th century. And this is also a classic. I don't know if you can see, but there is a figure on the ruins looking here at the Lion's Gate at Arni. The figure surveying the ruins is also a classic figure of the time in Western paintings, Western photography, Western poetry, and these photographs did also end up in the West. They're a way in which Armenians reconnected to a certain Armenian past, and it was also a part of a Western rediscovery of Armenia. These are Kukjian's photographs appearing in the London Illustrated Journal, The Graphic, in 1885. Some of those places I've mentioned, the Athens and Jerusalem and Cairo, Luxor, these were still the big draws for the West. But there was a growing constituency in the West that were becoming interested in the historic lands of Armenia. And this is bound up with photography. This is bound up with the making of images, showing Westerners images of Armenian lands, Armenian culture. But there is a certain clash here. Photography was for imperial consumption, but it was also part of nationalist identity formation. So there is a natural, these ideas don't quite go together. And it's said that Johannes Kukjian was eventually run out of Yerevan in the 1880s because his Armenian images did not find approval with the Russian authorities. So he first went to Vienna. Again, photography is on the move. So Kukjian first went to Vienna and then to Singapore, and then he ended up in Java, which was then under Dutch colonial rule. And he was advertising himself there as the official photographer to the Queen of Holland. And here's one of his Java images. Stayed there afterwards. This is I don't know if you can quite see, this is one of his studio images, and you get a little sense of the studio space, the studio backdrop behind him, behind the family, and the sense of the light coming from above. There is the suggestion of a skylight. Photographs were either made outside or they were made in very, very well lit studios, which would have required skylights to give a large amount of light for the making of pictures. Again, these small details, that would not have been a part of the finished photograph for this family who had who had commissioned this picture. But in these sort of small incidental details, you can sort of tell a lot about the picture-making process. And this is a Western family. So again, photography in Tehran pandered to Western visitors. It was part of the tourist trade. You could find his name in many travelogues of the time. And he was also involved in the Western obsession for monuments and archaeology. These are images from one of his most important commissions, and that was photographing Persepolis for the German archaeologist and art historian Friedrich Sara. Comprising of hundreds of images, it constitutes one of the most impressive photographic surveys of the era. And again, you can find evidence of imperial activity in these images, and how this part of the world had become a site for the playing out of imperial rivalries. The arrival of the Germans on the scene in the Near East is quite an important factor as well. It signals the shift of old allegiances, whereas the British fought with the Turks against the Russians in the Crimea. By the end of the century, the Germans were forming new alliances with the Turks. The British were forming a new alliance with the Russians, and the pieces of the board were being rearranged in the Near East. So Sevrugian found himself working for Western photographers, but he also produced his own images of Tehran, a modern developing Tehran, the sorts of things that were not generally for Western consumption. But again, we see how the emergence of domestic audiences creates new images, new types of images as well. So photographic studios spring up all over the region, but to begin with, they are certainly restricted to the larger cities. As to be expected, this is where the customers were to be found. It took longer for photography to reach some of the areas of substantial Armenian population, especially in the Ottoman East, where most Armenians were to be found at this time. And we should remember that at this time, something like 80% of them were rural dwelling peasants. So we're talking about quite different spaces now. We're going from the cities into the countryside, to the towns and the villages. And this also tells us something about the movement of people as well. The photography is always bound up with this idea of movement and this idea of migration, and we can follow the movement of people through the movement of photography. So this is quite an interesting image about migration. This was an era of new Armenian migration. Traveling for work had been part of Armenian life for a long time, with young men, they were predominantly young men, migrating for periods of time to the major commercial centers of the region. Constantinople, Smyrna, today known as Izmir, Adana, Baku, and Tbilisi. And this studio, the Sosorian studio from Harput, it was originally in Tbilisi that they learnt their trade. As migrants themselves to Tbilisi, they learnt the photographic trade in Russian Tbilisi, before returning to their hometown of Harput in the Ottoman Empire. And we can see how the business they established there, the first photographic studio in the Armenian provinces of the Ottoman Empire, was prompted by a new form of migration. People began traveling in greater numbers to more distant lands, and they stayed for longer periods. And once again, photography's arrival in this part of the world means a certain shift in the sorts of pictures that are being made. Photography is always made in accordance with local needs, tastes, desires, customs. And this was a time of great migration from Harput. This is the Vaznian family, and this is Mogradich on the right-hand side, who was just about to leave for America. So this is what became a convention in Armenian photography, particularly in provincial photography, is the family portrait, the final portrait on the eve of departure, the last picturing of the complete intact family unit before being separated by migration. This basically informed the whole way in which photographs were made. We can tell it's a picture about family. It's about an intact family unit. Almost every figure touches the person next to them, or is in some sort of physical contact with the person next to them. There is a few small gaps between people, but largely it's one main unit. It's a picture about family togetherness. Now, Mogradich was on his way to the USA, and migration was in large part connected with an increased contact with the outside world in the Armenian provinces. So one group of foreigners above all was instrumental, and these were the American missionaries who built up substantial presence in the Near East during the latter part of the 19th century. And these missionaries were often photographers themselves, so they contributed to the spread of the photographic practice in the Near East. And they also created avenues westwards as well, new connections that young Armenian men would follow, travelling westwards for work. This is a photograph made by an American missionary in Harput of a bakery. And you can, you probably can't see it here, but this is a little detail of the wall at the back of the bakery, where there are some clippings from American magazines, some American studio pictures. There's a story here about the modern American city, entitled City of Glass and Steel. Armenians started being in contact with these images of the modern, industrialized, wealthy West. And just as people in the West experienced the East through these new pictures that were being made and taken back, the East began to experience the West through these pictures as well. So this, for a place which was often in poverty, and men travelled for work, this created new desires to go to the places of fabled wealth in the West. And looking at these pictures that we can see through this tiny detail in this photograph, it shows you again one of photography's unique characteristics, an aspect that separates it from other image-making practices. Painting we might describe as a wholly active process, in that everything you find in a painting has been deliberately placed there by its maker. Photography is quite different in that it is semi-active. The photographer and the sitters have a measure of control over how the final image works, how the final image looks. There's also a measure of passivity and random chance. In other words, we might find things within photographs that nobody placed there on purpose. And I would suggest that this is one of those moments. The photograph was not made to show us these pictures on the wall, and yet we can see them because they've been captured almost as an incidental byproduct of making the picture. And so we see how through these small things, these small images that travelled, Armenians were afforded a glimpse of what life looked like in distant parts of the world, a glimpse that they would not have had without photography. And it was this Western contact fueled migration. But we should also remember those other aspects that fueled migration away from the Armenian provinces, the poverty and the hunger that I've mentioned, but also massacre as well. So this is another picture from Harput province. This is another studio, A&E Gabrielian. And this was, in fact, another family portrait, another family on the eve of departure. This was made a short while after a massacre in Harput, and the decision by the photographic family, or at least one part of the family that ran this photographic studio, to leave and go to America. So, as had been established through practice, a last picture was made before departure for other lands. So the photographer in this photograph steps over to the other side of the lens, showing us how photographers did not simply observe and record on behalf of others. They were not removed from the world and its moments of chaos. They were still subject to the social and political forces that shaped the lives of others. We can read a collision of personal history and wider history. These big massacres that shaped the history of the region and how they were played out on a smaller scale, the effect they had on those people. Even those that survived were greatly affected by these massacres, and it changed the whole outlook of the provinces. And photography often records these moments, these moments of change in people's lives. So photography in rural Armenian areas tends to be about family portraits, particularly, as I've said, before separation and departure. It's also about marriage pictures, births, and funerals as well. So again, I'm not quite sure if you can see this figure right in the center of the screen. This became one of the hallmarks of Armenian picture making, the photographing of the dead body before burial. It's something we can relate to the other family photograph we saw, or all of these actually. It's a sort of a picturing of the family unit. It's a picturing of togetherness. So it's a last photograph before burial. And there are also school photographs. Again, these are particular milestones in Armenian life, and schooling had a huge role to play. You can also, again, the picture is constructed in a very similar way to the family photographs. It's all about togetherness. There is a central seated character. There's normally the patriarch in the middle, the central figure. It's the corpse in this photograph. It's normally the father in family photographs, or it's the teacher in school photographs. And again, this is the idea of school photographs these were particular moments. These were moments of great achievement for students. These were moments when students were leaving school in order to join the wider community. These were moments to be marked. But these were also important. Photographs like this were important for the running of the schools as well. This is part of this sort of Armenian Renaissance, the opening up of Armenian schools which often followed the missionary schools which had been set up. The missionary movement, which spread through the Near East through the 19th century, prompted a response from the Ottoman government, from other missionaries, the French and German missionaries, and from local Armenian communities as well. So they all started to mimic those same things that missionaries had done, and schooling was a huge part of that. So a great number of Armenian schools were set up. To a certain extent, this also fed on migration as well. These were schools that were often set up with migrant money. The money that was being made in foreign lands was channeled back to the Armenian provinces. And this also explains why these photographs are made. These photographs are not just there to mark a certain occasion, but these photographs, like this photograph, and a lot of the other ones we see, were also made to be sent abroad with increasingly fractured communities. These were made so that those who lived abroad, those who were not there and present at the time, could still play a role within the community. So they could be physically present. They could be present at the wedding, or they could be sort of imaginatively present, as it were. They could be present at the wedding. They could be present at the funeral. They could pay their last rites, pay their respects. And they could be present at graduations as well. And this was very important, especially when these were the people that were relied upon to send money back, places set up with migrant money. This was part of a sort of an international community. Photographs allowed an increasingly fractured Armenian communities to exist and to continue. So this is the central figure here is Tilgadinci. He He was a great writer and poet of Harput, and also an important teacher as well, who was not only were these schools set up with migrant money, but they were also set up basically in response to migration as well, in order to train the next generation of Armenians to try and reinforce some sort of local infrastructure as well, so that there wasn't just this brain drain abroad. And you see Armenian schools and colleges set up all over the Near East. This is another important one, Sanasarian College in Erzurum. In fact, next week's speaker, or the subject of next week's, George Gergian spent some time at the Sanasarian College in Erzurum, so you'll hear more about this place. And he was a photographer as well, and also a chemist, so there are a number of different overlaps there. And you see in the center of this is Mogradich Sanasarian in the center of the image, who set up this place in Erzurum before going to St. Petersburg. So he was absent in St. Petersburg at the time the image was made. But he still has the central part of the image. He still plays that, he still is given the patriarchal role. His photograph was there to mark his absence. And this was the role that images were playing. Not just the images in photographs, but photographs themselves. They were created often because of this absence. And the normal school in Van, this was another important educational establishment of the time. You may not be able to see the detail, but a lot of these professors have been pasted in, so not all of them were there on the day that the photograph was made. Often there are photographers go to great lengths in order to construct these scenes of bringing people together. This is an Armenian family in Constantinople. You can see that there's a space left right in the middle. This is a portrait in progress because there were still family members to be added into this scene. There was two members of the family who were migrants abroad. So there was a space deliberately left in the image, and later they sent a photograph of themselves, and this was sort of slotted in to the back there. It was, as I say, a way of, photography was about connecting distant people. It was not just about constructing an image of togetherness and solidarity, even though that was an important part of the process. For families, friends, communities who were increasingly divided by time and geography, having these little visual, these images of togetherness were very important. But this was also just about part of, there was just the correspondence between lands, an exchange of pictures. This was like the writing of letters, and often these photographs accompanied letters. It would be part of that communication process. And we see a trend of, we go from families pictured together to the effort to reconstruct the family, or these separate images of separated families. Pictures which would have sort of crossed somewhere in the world. The father who was off working in America and the family he left behind. So the migrant would send back a photograph, probably looking very well-to-do,